Perhaps in no other times there's been such an interest in the persona, individuality of Judas Iscariot. It seems almost as the times call for this interest. Almost symbolically, in that regard, one can say among the documents that were dug out, discovered in the 20th century, is also the so-called Gospel of Judas, which resurfaced in Egypt in around 1970. It is written in Coptic language. It is one of those documents that are called Gnostic Gospels. And it's available online. You can look it up if you want. It's quite interesting, a short document where Judas is the one who appears to be chosen by Jesus. Quote from from this gospel: there is a moment when Christ, with his disciples, triggers their anger. He says something, the way Jesus speaks in the Gospels, it's often what we would say today quite controversial. Very often Christ cuts straight to the chase. And unlike in the canonical Gospels, there's a moment in the Gospel of Judas where they get really angry. Imagine that. The disciples, the apostles, get angry at Jesus. And he says here, why has this agitation led you to anger? Your God who is within you have provoked you to anger, have provoked your anger, your souls to anger. And so it goes, and all of a sudden Judas says to him, I know who you are and where you have come from. The ensue conversation between Judas and Jesus goes forward, says to him, step away from the others, and I shall tell you the mysteries of the kingdom. It is possible for you to reach it, but you will grieve a great deal. It's an extraordinary thought, very unorthodox thought, according to the Gospel of Judas, that Judas had a very special place in Christ's heart. So much so that he made him to a sort of an esoteric disciple, according to this document. In this Gospel of Judas, Christ has a special name for Judas too. He calls him, you 13th spirit. Another quote here, Judas said, Master, as you have listened to all of them, now also listen to me, for I have seen a great vision. When Jesus heard this, he smiled, he laughed, and said to him, you 13th spirit, why do you try so hard? But speak up, and I shall bear with you. And once again, at some point, Jesus answered and said, you, Judas, will become the 13th, and you will be cursed by the other generations, and you will come to rule over them. In the last days, they will curse your ascent to the holy generation. Number 13 is very integral to the composition of the Gospel of John and also to the Apocalypse of John. When we look at the canonical Gospels, so the Gospel of Matthew, Gospel of Mark, Luke, and John, there Judas is considered and is known under a different number. Often, maybe even every time the talk about Judas is mentioned, the sentence begins with the word Judas, one of the 12. Judas, one of the 12. The time when the Gospels were written, the consciousness of human beings, those who were the recipients of that word, as well as those who wrote those documents, were very different than our consciousness. Of course, we know that coming out of anthroposophy, it's the baseline of our work, the evolution of the human soul, of human spirit, the evolution of human being. And in context of that name, given to Judas by the synoptics and by John, we have to imagine that when people of those days in the past spoke of one, they didn't have the same inner experience of the soul when we say one today. How much do you make per hour? $1. Ha ha ha, I make 10. I have more than you. In those days, one was considered the highest of all numbers. This is something that you can observe still today if you work with children, that before the crossing of Rubicon at the age of 9, maybe let's say before the 4th grade, children still in a certain sense count in a similar way. One is the totality, is the wholeness, the highest number, so to speak. So what does it mean that the Gospels call Judas one of the 12? The other aspect of that is, we know, of course, that Judas was the treasurer of the 12, something we would call treasurer today, meaning he was the one who holds the sack with money. Chapter 13 of John, the beginning of the Last Supper. This is shortly after washing of the feet. When he had said this, the Spirit was stirred profoundly, and he bore witness, "Yes, I tell you, one of you will betray me." The disciples looked at one another, at a loss to know whom he meant. I'll get back to the moment which is quoted right now. I move ahead a few verses. After he had taken the morsel, Jesus said to him, "What you are about to do, do it soon." Now, but none of those at the table understood why he said what he said. Some thought because Judas was in charge of money, Jesus was saying, buy what we need for the festival, or that he should give something to the poor. The one can imagine a person of certain authority, the one who is equipped with, put it frankly, dealing with money. Not everyone has this skill, especially when it gets to organizations or communities. The 12 had a treasurer. Judas, we see from those accounts, were equipped to bear that responsibility. Maybe we could also say bear that burden. John is not at all fond of Judas. In fact, he calls him a liar and a thief who was stealing from that purse. In as much as we know the process that led to calling of the disciples. This is called the catalog of the disciples in Christianity, in theology. So we know that the first who were called were Peter and Andrew, then the sons of Zebedee, James and John, then Bartholomew, Nathaniel, and so on, so on. It is interesting that anytime this account is given in the Gospels, Judas is simply there. We don't know how and under what circumstances was Judas called. It's an interesting thing, because when you take it as such, as a statement, one can interpret it as if Judas was always there. And with this, we're touching up on an important feature and understanding of the Gospels. Very important to our work, namely that the Gospels are not necessarily always only the accounts of actual events that took place in time and space. That too, but not always. There are places, and they are frequent, where the accounts of the evangelist weave from the actual, sense perceptible, and higher consciousness, the imagination, the inspiration, the intuition. We're, in a certain sense, called to really work with the gospel, read the gospel in such a way that we can sense, we can feel it in our heart, when these powerful crossings of the threshold between the visible and supersensible world take place. Those words written in the gospel, they're also in that regard always adequate, they're always present, meaning it's not only a history of certain events that once took place, had taken place, but something that in an etheric realm, in the elemental world, is as archetype, as spiritual content, always happening. And in that regard, it's fascinating to look closer at those types, not individual destinies of the apostles, of the disciples, of the persona of the drama, like for instance, Pontius Pilate, but to think what they represent, and not only in a simply symbolic way, as we would like to say today after Carl Gustav Jung, but truly as eternal templates of human behaviors, of human stories, of human tendencies. For generations preceding the mystery of Golgotha, when the so-called religious documents are more and more imaginative even than the Gospels themselves, and also after the mystery of Golgotha, the Gospels particularly served the human being as tools, as keys to understand who we are. There was no psychology in the medieval times, in the times of scholastics, until the Enlightenment, until quite recently, the breakthrough of the 20th century, when psychology in fact became a tool of understanding who you are. The gospel was that for vast parts of humanity. And if one wanted to see a little bit about yourself in that capacity which is represented by Judas, one would study Judas. Neither was it supported nor encouraged. Knowledge of that in us, which is of different origin than the divine origin, has certain capacities, has certain tendencies, has been there for a very long time, maybe even forever since the beginning, was in a certain sense forbidden. And in a consequence of that, Judas became something of a representative of that in me which I don't want to have anything to do with. A representative of that part in us that we don't want to look towards. In our language, we have a name for a function represented by such types. Scapegoats. Someone who takes on, we could say today again after Jung, projections of many and kind of bears that on his or her shoulders as an outcast. Interestingly, that word scapegoat comes from the Bible too, from the Old Testament, namely from the book of Leviticus, the book of priests. And there in chapter 16:8, we hear of cultus, a ritual which was given to the Jews through Moses, a ritual of the scapegoat. Namely, on a certain day of the year, Aaron, the high priest, and all his descendants were to take two young goats, male goats, before maturation, and cast lots between them two. One would be sacrificed by the priest, and the blood of this animal would be sprinkled on the altar and on the Ark of the Covenant. And the second one, in a highly ritualistic, cultic, liturgical way, would be bestowed with the sum total of all transgressions and sins of the entire chosen folk and chased away in the desert. In fact, this became a part of the liturgy of Yom Kippur, of the Jewish Michaelmas. This used to be cultivated as long as the Second Temple still stood. The word for scapegoat in the Hebrew language is interestingly Azazel, which literally means Azazel, the goat of burden, the one who carries away the guilt of the nation. This, we have to imagine, this was cultivated around the temple for hundreds of years before Christ incarnated in Jesus, before the events of the 3 years, before the events of Golgotha took place. The image, the symbol, the spiritual reality reflected into liturgy, that the great deed of atonement requires 2 sacrifices. That of the young goat, maybe we could even boldly say of the lamb, and the other one of the scapegoat, lamb and a goat. I will get back for a moment to this idea of Judas representing something in the soul, human soul. My soul, your soul, her soul, and so on. Our human soul, which was always there, and yet people did not have tools to work with it as yet. The mystery of evil, we can call it today. 25,920 years is the so-called Platonic year. If we divide it by 12 parts, it's around 2160 years. After Rudolf Steiner, we know this is the length of the so-called cosmic epoch of becoming of the human being. We are right now in the 5th post-Atlantean epoch, as Rudolf Steiner called it, which is also known as the era, the epoch of the consciousness soul. Astronomically speaking, that means that the sun rises on spring equinox in the constellation of Pisces, the sign of Christ, but also the sign of great duality. Every of these grand epochs not only constitutes the human being of those given times, but also poses kind of existential basic questions. The human being, all of us, has to wrestle with cardinal questions brought by every one of these epochs. Just like in the epoch when the mystery of Golgotha took place, that was the question of death and existence of human spirit beyond the moment of crossing the threshold, the life after death. Today, in our times, and we can observe that this is still an emerging question, it is a question of evil. This era, which according to Rudolf Steiner started around 1413, is the time when we will have to, out of cosmic necessity, as a species, as a generation, as it's called in the Gospels, wrestle and understood the question of evil. And of course, it is only with the beginning of the 20th century, and only now, so perhaps 600 years after the beginning of this process, that we have come to the realization that we cannot speak about the question of evil outside or excluding ourselves. So in other words, just as it was appropriate in the time when the Gospels was written to shun Judas and to cast him away, to assign him as the scapegoat, we are no longer able to do this today. And if we do, even bigger evil is introduced to our social life, our life on earth. Perhaps it is a time for us to invite Judas back, at least in the capacity to wanting to know that in us, which in the Gospels is represented by this sorrowful destiny.